Hi, everyone, and good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on which part of the world you're in. Welcome to this knowledge session that we have specially curated for you on the occasion of the 50th World Environment Day, which is today. The theme for this year's World Environment Day is Beat Plastic Pollution. We all know that plastic is a choking hazard for our planet. But how would you react if I told you that there is some form of plastic in your clothes as well? Plastic at the end of the day is a polymer, much like a synthetic polyester derived from the hydrocarbon chain, which is blended with cotton in so many items of our daily clothing. Thankfully, there is a movement afoot to champion sustainable fashion across the globe today. Google tells us that sustainable fashion is an all inclusive term that refers to products, processes, activities, and stakeholders, such as policymakers, brands, and consumers, aiming to make the fashion sector carbon neutral based on equality, social justice, animal welfare, and ecological integrity. To develop a better appreciation and understanding of sustainable fashion, we have a power packed lineup of speakers today. Without further ado, let me welcome Maya Vengurlekar, Chief Operating Officer, Crisil Foundation, and Senior Director, Marketing and Communications at Crisil, to share her opening address. Maya, over to you.
Thank you, Avik, for setting the context and that very powerful opening to this session. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you from whichever part of the world you are joining this webinar from. Today is International World Environment Day, as Avik said, and it is a special one because it's a 50th WED. So let's begin this essential webinar by highlighting 3 data points that shed light on why sustainable fashion is becoming increasingly crucial. So as you can see on the slide, the fashion industry is responsible for 8 to 10% of global emissions, surpassing the combined emissions of the aviation and shipping industries put together. The production of a single white cotton shirt emits the same amount of emissions as driving 35 miles or 56 kilometers in a car. 500,000 tons of plastic microfibers are dumped into the ocean annually, equivalent of 50 billion plastic bottles. Clearly, the environmental impact of fashion is evident in 3 areas: water, microplastics, and energy. And during our conversation with our guest, Priyanka, we are going to find out more about how fashion, rather fast fashion, is threatening our environment and our collective future. The idea is to trigger a strong sense of urgency to act responsibly. We are already doing a bunch of things at Crisil, and very quickly I can familiarize you with what we are doing at Crisil. So as a responsible corporate citizen, Crisil has always adhered to the mantra of doing good with what we are good at. And we fulfill this in 3 ways. Firstly, being a data and research company, we provide well-researched insights that enable informed decision-making for corporates on the ESG agenda. Secondly, as a responsible citizen, again, corporate citizen, we implement measures or we have implemented measures within our corporate offices to improve energy and water consumption efficiency. And last but not the least, we leverage our corporate responsibility mandate to enhance urban green cover and promote water efficiency in rural communities. As part of Crisil's ESG thought leadership, we have published 2 editions of Crisil's ESG/Sustainability Yearbook in 21 and 22. And the edition for 2023 is in production and it will be released soon. These publications involve pro bono research, which has analyzed and scored about 575 Indian companies across 53 sectors based on the quality and quantity of disclosures on the parameters of environmental, social, and governance, which is ESG. Since 2020, Crisil has made conscious efforts to monitor our own GHG emission footprint, and we have successfully reduced our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions by over 30% based on the 2019 as our base year. Through our CSR mandate, our flagship program, Main Pragati in Assam, we are supporting over 1,500 women weavers and their households, which are engaged in production of organic varieties of silk and traditional craft of weaving on handlooms. These initiatives contribute to building a sustainable supply chain for clothing. Our environment conservation projects have resulted in a significant increase in green cover, with over 150,000 trees planted till date. Today, we are privileged to have Priyanka Khanna from Fashion for Good with us, who will share her valuable insights on sustainable fashion. I believe her presence couldn't have come at a better time as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of World Environment Day. By way of quick introduction, Priyanka heads the Asia region and supplier relations for Fashion for Good, where she works closely with the textile manufacturing ecosystem in Asia to drive the circular transition of the industry with multiple stakeholders like the suppliers, brands, and innovators. She has over 15 years of experience across multiple industries. Priyanka has an MBA from Oxford University. Fashion for Good is a global initiative to inspire and drive the collective movement to make fashion a force for good. What's really interesting is the way they work directly with the fashion industry to innovate solutions for the people and planet, and even empower behavior change through their Sustainable Fashion Museum. Before I conclude my address, I would like to share an infographic, which will not only set the tone for Priyanka's presentation, but also might change the way you look at your own wardrobe. Looking at this slide, you will see to produce just one t-shirt, one pair of jeans, and one pair of cotton socks. It takes a staggering 13,000 liters of water, and it is fresh water, I'm told, equivalent to approximately 27,500 ml water bottles. I hope this will help us understand what each one of us individually can do to slow down the pace of destruction caused by our inadvertent actions. As we let these figures sink in, I invite Priyanka to share her insights. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thank you, Maya. That was an excellent introduction to our work in a way also, and really setting stage for what I'm going to talk about, especially the last infographics. I'm sure everybody's already thinking a lot about the destruction the industry is creating. So hi, everyone. As Maya introduced me already, I'm Priyanka. I head the Asia region for Fashion for Good. I'm here to talk to you guys about the fashion industry, its impact, and the road to decarbonization. But very quickly, before I go into the fashion industry, I'd love to introduce our work and basically what we do to make the difference in the industry. So I'm part of Fashion for Good. Our vision or our goal or why we were set up is really to accelerate and scale sustainable innovation in the fashion industry. Yes. So it's quite simple for us that we believe our role in the ecosystem is to get the industry to embrace new innovations so that the current business model in the fashion industry, which has been there for decades, if not centuries, can actually transform and become more sustainable. And while doing so, we also realize we need to create a totally new mindset, which is where consumers and the industry comes into play together. Our goal or our approach so far has been to identify the new types of technology innovation that exists in the industry. So actually, we had scouted for over 3,000 technologies. That means we've looked at over 3,000 technologies across the fashion industries. We validate through the means of programs and projects by working with the technologies that are the best of best, who have the potential to actually scale up in the industry. And as we cross the validation function, a subset of those get ready for scale and adoption, which is where we support the entire industry to create as many implementation use cases for these technologies as possible. We are fortunate to work with some of the leading players in the world. We're supported by 26 of the, let's say, largest organizations, particularly brands and manufacturers of the fashion industry, who are really working closely with us and the technologies to test and then build them into their future plans, so build them into their supply chain. We are on the consumer side, as part of our consumer engagement strategy, we also run world's first sustainable fashion innovation museum. Here, through a heritage building in the center of Amsterdam, we also help the consumers as well as people who work in the industry and fashion brands understand the impact of the clothes you wear on a clothes you interact with on a regular basis, very similar to, as Maya said earlier, the microplastics and all the emissions that come out of it is explained in the museum. And we also help you understand what you as consumers can do today to make the change happen, or to make better decisions, or to force the industry to make better decisions. So that's a little bit about us. Later in Q&A, happy to answer more questions about our work if anyone's interested. But coming to understanding the fashion industry, from a fashion supply chain, I find this very interesting, given that it's an industry that every single person engages with. We all buy stuff, we all own stuff, we all wear stuff. But very few people are actually aware what goes into actually making the garment that you wear on a regular basis. When you look at something as tiny as the jacket you're wearing or the t-shirt you're wearing today, there are 6 to 7 steps to make that happen, or larger steps, and actually multiple engagements from the material stage all the way till you actually get the garment. So I want to give you a quick overview of what that supply chain actually looks like. Starting with raw materials, which in fashion industry's case is quite varied. You have the raw materials that are renewable, you have the raw materials that are completely naturally crop-based, for example, cotton, which is one of the largest materials in the world till date. Cotton, which comes from cotton farms, cultivated, then a whole process, or 6 to 7 process to actually get it to a fiber stage, which can be then spun into yarns. Yarns are really like the threads we see, and then further steps for it to happen to actually create a fabric. So that entire process is what raw materials is. But cotton is only one kind, and it's quite natural, right? But huge amount of water goes into creating even a kilo of cotton. On the other hand, the extreme other end, we have materials like polyester, which are completely fossil fuel related, so non-renewable materials. And this is where some of the microplastic challenges that we spoke about came earlier, because it's cheap, it's easy to use, but creates a lot of pollution in the environment. And these are just 2 of the primary materials. There are a range of other materials that go from silk to viscose, lyocells, etc. So raw material industry itself is a separate industry in itself, if you look at a sub-industry here. Then comes the processing stage, where really each and every garment, for example, the jacket that I wear is black. Where does the black ink come from? It's not as easy, and it's one of the harshest, or let's say the more impactful phases of the fashion industry, wherein there are pre-treatments of fabric that needs to be pre-treated with lots of chemicals so that it can take on a dye. Dyeing itself has 5 or 6 ways of doing it, applying the dyes. And in fact, the dyeing stuff uses huge amount of waters and chemicals as well, and energy. And then comes finishing to make sure the dye stays on your garments and doesn't run off. So processing stage with respect to water and chemical usage and energy usage is one of the largest impact areas in the industry. Then we come to cut, bake, trim, which is really where wastage is created because of damages or cut-offs from different kind of t-shirt making, etc. Until then you finally reach the retail and use stage when you as consumers actually get to wear these garments. Most of us think the industry ends there. However, once you're done with the garments, being Indian, you're probably handing down these materials forward. However, at some point of time, these garments become waste. And that waste, which lands up into huge amount of waste that we see now in oceans, in landfills. India, of course, is a more sustainable market in comparison, but India has one of the largest textile waste generated across the world. In fact, I think the percentage is about 12% of world's textile waste is actually generated in India, both from factory as well as post-consumer. But if you do see continents like Europe or countries like US who are actually exporting a lot of their textile waste to Africa, to India, and a couple of other areas, all of that textile waste is actually sitting either in oceans or outside in landfills. And this is the waste that has a huge potential to also come back into the industry as new raw materials, but is not being utilized currently. Then in the fashion supply chain, there are overarching areas, for example, packaging, water, etc., which are maybe other industries that also interact and work with fashion industry very closely. So now that I've given you a bit of lay of the land of the fashion industry, it's good to understand where all these emissions really lie. I spoke about this a little earlier, that raw material to actual processing, which is water and energy intensive, to actual final material production, which is what we call the tier 4 to tier 2 of the industry, is where most of the carbon emissions lie. If you look at 67% of carbon emissions only come from raw materials and that processing stage. So for a hugely impactful industry, there are two sub areas which are responsible for most of the emissions in the industry. And this was basically something we discovered in one of the reports that we had launched earlier last year in understanding the opportunity of decarbonization in the fashion industry. So now that we understand that there are impact areas that are very, very high, we try to understand through some of our research and work, how is it that we can actually get to net zero and be sustainable in the fashion industry? How do we create or make fashion a force for good, which is the mission that we set out on? We realize that a lot of the existing solutions that are now prevalent in the market, like shift towards renewable energies or scaling more sustainable ways of doing agriculture or creating basically more energy efficiency in the industry, can actually reduce maximum emissions. So 45% of the emissions of the industry can only come from energy usage change and material changes. However, if we still want to get to net zero, there's huge other work that still needs to be done. And our assessment is that 36% of all of that decarbonization steps will really come from innovative solutions. And what do those innovative solutions look like? It's particularly scaling up next generation materials. For example, when I say next gen materials, how do we take clothes that are completely dumped and discarded? How do we recycle them so that they can come back as new fibers? So we don't have to use less of cotton and less of polyester and less of other materials that are harmful. How do we create other material or new raw material opportunities that are not necessarily very resource intensive? And on the other hand, processing, which is where the most energy and water comes in, how do we take it from completely high energy and wet, that is water process, to mostly dry process, so that we use least amount of waters, least amount of chemicals, as well as least amount of energies. So these are the key areas of innovations that we at Fashion for Good really focus on. So when we talk about innovations and technologies, I've said this a lot. This is just an overview. This might be too technical for the audience here, but it would be good to understand what do we really mean by technologies. When we say raw materials, we look at new technologies, for example, as renewable polymers, so getting away from polyester or other natural fibers that are much less resource intensive than cotton, or other animal fibers or bio-based leather, because leather is completely animal driven. So all of these are, for examples of innovation areas. Within this, we work with multiple technologies in one segment, and we try to scale them up. Similarly, when I talk about dyeing, finishing, that is a processing stage, we talk about how do we create non-synthetic and promote more natural materials and natural processes. So we look at from microbial pigments to all sorts of alternate enzyme-based, plasma-based applications to completely move away from synthetics. So in this, without going too detailed into what these technology areas are, these are the three key areas that we put most of our energy in scaling, because this is where the key impact lies: materials, processing, and end of use. So big question is then, how are we trying to achieve this? What we believe that we need to pull together as orchestrators of this industry is we need to bring together all the key actors to the same table to educate them and to develop work with them so that we can validate that newer technologies are possible to be scaled up and that we can change the footprint of the industry. Here we look at bringing together brands who are the really drivers of this consumption, whether it's the amount of consumption that has been created to what kind of supply chain to use is sitting with the brands. Then there's supply chain partners, because none of the brands really own their supply chain. Supply chain does live outside in regions like Asia, in South America, in Turkey. And these are the regions that are really manufacturing at large, completely given or driven by brands' direction. So we realize there are important stakeholders that have to be educated and brought to the table. Other than that, we also engage funders, investors, the technologies, and then public sector actors. We believe all of these key actors are required to actually disrupt the current system in the industry. So how we do this, or how we bring these stakeholders together, I'm just giving a few examples here of some of the projects that we are driving that we believe will change the face of the industry. Some of the good examples here would be circularity, where through a bunch of our projects, we are aiming to bring textile waste completely back into the supply chain so that we reduce the pressure on new raw materials. Another great project would be agri-waste, where we're looking at how agricultural waste that is currently burned in countries like India and other areas within Southeast Asia can be brought into or can become a new raw material for the fashion industries, again, putting less pressure on new raw materials. And then dry factory, where we're really developing combination of technologies to understand how do we use the least amount of chemicals and water by working with new age technologies and a mix of those. Our opinion or our way forward is collaboration. We believe collaborative innovation is the key in unlocking that scale that is required in the industry to actually see the emissions reducing in the industry. Just towards the end, I would love to share a couple of just a broad overview of some of our projects, and that particularly are also relevant for the Indian market. So agricultural waste, I spoke about this earlier. What we are doing in this project is we are looking at the feedstocks of agriculture. We are trying to understand which of the feedstocks are relevant for fiber production in the fashion industry. And we are working with lots of technologies to understand who can actually create fibers, or let's say blended fibers that actually can be scaled in the industry. So for example, in the first phase of these projects, we've been working with hemp waste, pineapple waste, banana waste. So agricultural waste after you use the fruit, that is the waste that has no applications currently. In the next iteration, we'll work with rice and wheat waste, which is a huge amount of waste that is generated and burnt across North India, for example. And the idea would be to identify which of the technologies can make something for the industry and which of the brands really, because the brands are the ones who have to create the purchasing power here, can use this waste and actually put them in commercial collections. It's pretty early stage as these are really new technologies, but in the next 1 to 2 years, we hope to be able to scale some of these technologies. Similarly, another example would be our consortium projects on circularity. We think of circularity as a supply and demand problem. So on the supply side, there's huge amount of textile waste that we know of that exists, that are lying around oceans and landfills, but it needs to really be sorted, processed so that recycling technologies can use this, especially when it comes to post-consumer waste that you and I have already worn, and then needs to be separated and segregated. And this is a couple of our projects are now focused on how do we create sorting infrastructure or traceable sorting infrastructure across the world. One of our initiatives is in India, where we've been trying to understand the scale of textile waste, the types of textile waste, and how do we create sorting infrastructure within India. For example, bringing actually organizations a business model so that they can actually become sorters and create enough demand or create enough supply, for the recyclers. On the other hand, we look at how do we bring these new age recycling technologies into manufacturing markets so that they can actually scale up. So this is really the example of the India project, where we launched a study last year in assessing all the opportunity that exists in waste, and really brought the textile ministries to the table to actually speak about this topic as well as support us. And now we start to see policies being put in place for some aspects, not all just yet. And then we've been driving multiple pilots to create the sorting ecosystem. So very last thing, and I believe I've run out of time as well, but the last slide that I guess I would want to touch upon is what are the key drivers for transforming this industry? We believe scaling innovation. So innovation now that we know exists really needs to be scaled up. But there's no way that that can work in isolation. For any scaling or for any innovation to be scaled up, it does need systems and infrastructures in place. And these systems and infrastructures, for example, with respect to circularity, we can't scale up technologies until we have sorting infrastructures. And really, the government bodies, the policy and regulations supporting these technologies to work together and the systems to come in place. So it's really all that goes in together. An interesting piece here is the changing consumer demand. While a lot of this is policy driven, industry driven, and really decarbonization targets driven, the pressure that really still is needed, especially in manufacturing countries where policy isn't that strong, is to really start changing the consumer demand. As consumers' demand change, it's extra pressure on the industry to actually change faster and cater to the consumers to actually retain their competitive edge. So consumer demand does play a huge role in this space. And then lastly, investments. Investments is what is enabling all of this to happen, whether it's investments through catalytic organizations, through brands, or through government bodies, or completely private equity or venture capital business. That is all that is required to transform the industry. I'm going to leave you here with a really sad image. We all know this is a reality we face, especially in India. We face the effects of global warming and all the climate change quite closely now. So it's for each of us to take action, whether it's challenging what we buy to actually assessing how we want to consume in the future. So yeah, I'll leave you here. And I'll hand over to Avik now. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. I think that was eye-opening to say the least. And the next purchase that any of us make for a piece of clothing, either from a store or from e-commerce, will require a lot of introspection. But having said that, I think it's time to dive into a very riveting fireside chat to really think and build upon what Priyanka left us with in terms of the industry and the realities of the industry and where it is headed. You mentioned, Priyanka, about consumer demand, and that is what we are trying to get at here, that how we as Crisilites can practice this ourselves and influence the ecosystem around us to build that pressure from the consumer to make the industry change for the better. Joining Priyanka for this fireside chat would be Meenal Bhosle, Senior Director Corporate Secretarial at Crisil. In addition to being company secretary, Meenal anchors Crisil's ESG initiatives at an entity level. Welcome, Meenal, and over to you.
Thank you, Avik. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We just heard Priyanka speak at length about the great potential for innovation in the fashion industry and which can drive sustainability of the fashion value chain. At the same time, on a daily basis, the consumer is exposed to fast fashion, which makes available inexpensive clothing at a rapid pace to be in line with the latest fashion trends, and also contributes to a culture of throwaway, use and throw. As the negative consequences of emissions and waste become obvious to youngsters especially, consumers would like to understand how to make fashion choices which are more sustainable and less damaging to the environment. During the course of our conversation with Priyanka over the next 15 minutes, I will be delving into the consumer perspective of sustainable fashion. So Priyanka, my first question is around, you spoke about the brands that Fashion for Good has worked with and has partnered with them in the innovation lab. Let me start with asking you whether for the consumer there is any guidance or any mark or any other global guidance available to understand that a particular product that he or she is buying is from a sustainable background. It has and what are the dimensions of sustainability that you should look at when you're actually purchasing clothes or any such products?
Sure. I think this is a two-part question. I think the first is, are there any guidance or standardizations available which tell you what is sustainable or not? Just like any other industry, when new things happen, I believe it takes time to even come up with the right standards, which is the kind of flux that the fashion industry is in right now. If you see lots of brands already start putting their collections as sustainable collection or recycle collection. But if you dig deeper, you'll realize currently the laws in certain areas, and certain areas there are no laws. For example, in Europe, is only a percentage recycle. If you're X percentage recycled material, you can still call it recycle. But actually, in the longer run, that wouldn't be the case. Once there is full development of what is considered recycle, I think these standardizations would be built. So each year we are seeing newer policies or newer, let's say, claims come in, and sometimes they are completely abolished. Sometimes we see every year something increases. But at the moment, to say this is the final thing to consider, this is sustainable, these are the final claims, that does not necessarily exist. So as consumers, which are really not a great time for consumers, because it's not only as much as you can decide on. But I think if you could be a conscious consumer, to answer your second question, which is what can the consumers do? I think the big question is everything is available online. Research, ask questions, challenge the brands, and really read the labels to understand what is really sustainable or not sustainable. But that is also particular to when you are buying new. There's also a huge wave of consumerism now with the newer, more aware consumers, that they don't necessarily want to buy as much new things. The fact that you can go towards more repair, the more resale, that is the secondhand purchases, are probably the more sustainable way to go forward without actually being able to calculate what the benefit is. We know that at least we need to keep garments into circulation for as long as possible. So for example, if a life cycle of a t-shirt or a lifetime of a t-shirt with you is about 3 to 4 years, how do you keep that for up to 20 years or 25 years? And given that everybody does get bored wearing the same things, if you maintain your clothes well, you're able to potentially circulate it or sell it to another person who might be able to use it for another 3 to 4 years. It's still hard to say something will reach 20 years or 25 years, but you want to keep the clothes into circulation as long as possible. And some of the interesting ways of doing that is to be conscious about how you are washing your clothes. For example, we advise in our museum that you don't need to wash your denims until it's actually dirty. This overwashing creates more and more microplastics in the environment. And microfibers are also shed out by natural materials. So the more you can maintain your clothes and consider them as assets, the longer that you can keep them in the in circulation. And potentially you have an opportunity to sell them. So yeah, wardrobes are now like assets to be able to move that. And then of course, India already has a repair culture, but how could we indulge more in repair and rework to bring more and more sustainability, or let's say reduce your individual footprint?
Thank you, Priyanka. That's an interesting thought about washing clothes lesser. I'm sure, some of us on the webinar would just love it because, yeah, I mean that also has another dimension of the work element. Okay, but there's an interesting thought around the second hand use of clothes that you mentioned. So in the more developed economies, you do see a culture of thrifting, and you also see quite a few second hand shops where you get second hand stuff, but not so much in India. So is there any social stigma associated with this, and is there anything that the industry or the government or anybody could do anything about the social stigma associated with using somebody else's second-hand goods?
Absolutely. It's always been a social stigma. Given that India has the culture of hand-me-downs, but buying it from somebody else is actually quite a lot of social stigma. But in the last year and a half, we've seen that change quite a lot. Not still at the scale we wanted to change, but the thrifting culture, the secondhand platforms that are starting to come up, for example, like the Kiabzas of the world or the Reloves of the world, who are actually promoting buying secondhand. So I can give you examples of some of the technologies that we support as well. For example, Relove is a technology that's more of a white label platform, which means if I'm a brand, and this is 100% Indian technology, which is this technology is saying if I'm a brand like, let's say, Okai or somebody local from India, I can buy my own things and sell through my own platform, which means for me as a business, there is a second income because the same thing that I sold the first time around, now I can sell it again by buying it back from the consumer. But obviously, these are models that are being tested out. They're still not at scale, but they're starting to gain a lot of traction now. Then we have technologies like Kiabza who are doing a full washing process. They're putting lots and lots of washing and cleaning elements to assure the consumers that what they are getting is fresh and, let's say, hygienic stuff that they are receiving. And really the thought process for a lot of these is how do we create C2C, so consumer to consumer exchanges of clothes. In Europe, you would see an app called Vinted, which is 100% how consumers can sell to each other. And it's sending millions of pieces a year. And that's the kind of numbers we would think India should have also, given the amount of users that are there.
Maybe an OLX for fashion.
Potentially, yes. Maybe better UI and UX for that. Yeah.
Okay. How easy do you think it is to practice sustainable fashion for an office-going, for the office-going people? Like we use so much material which is either animal-based, like leather for purses and belts, shoes, and also polyester mixed material, which is so common and easily accessible. So how easy it's to transform, from this, which is, I mean, as I said, common, easily accessible, and also not very expensive as compared to, pure cotton blend. So how easy is to do this transformation?
In my opinion, it's actually not that difficult. It is the common perception in the market is sustainability or anything that counts as sustainability is more expensive, because I believe at least the first adoption of sustainable materials were more in a very boutique-y, more luxury manner. So it comes in the luxury products, but that's not necessary, especially if you look at the secondhand, the repair, the rework or redesign, something it's actually much more easier in India to do that. If you talk about leather, when you buy new, yes, it comes from animals. It's actually quite unsustainable, but leather can last forever, which means the more secondhand leather, like if you are using secondhand leather and buying these secondhand platforms leather, the quality doesn't really go bad. It really does require some finishing on top. So it becomes much easier and much more cost effective in the longer run to be more sustainable, as long as you don't associate sustainable to some luxury brands only.
So what I hear you say is that there is a trend that this will become more affordable with scale and greater acceptability.
It's a chicken and egg situation. The more consumers opt in for secondhand or the repair models, the cheaper and more accessible it'll get. Because right now these platforms are struggling to find the right stock. But if there is demand, the stock comes accordingly. So it really is, the more demand comes in, the more the secondhand platforms can pick up and the better the quality of stuff they can get.
For an end consumer, out of the two dimensions of, buying the clothes that you need to, and, and seeing how they're disposed, between the two, which is just as a regular, person, office going person, what is it that should be of more focus, the disposing part of it or the purchasing part of it?
I believe at this point of time, your purchasing decisions are more important, especially because currently disposal ecosystem does not exist. While as a consumer, you can say, I can dispose here versus here. Those options or the structure doesn't exist, which should hopefully in the next coming future. But what is more important, I believe, as a consumer, is really making the right purchasing decisions. And it's hard to say what is right or wrong because there is a lot of misinformation in the market, but to be able to be aware and ask the right questions, the first question should really be, are you required to buy more? Because that also, like you said earlier, we're driven by fast fashion as a very consumption-based cultures now, but that's not necessary. That is really not necessary to your survival or even for you to thrive. So that probably is the first question. Do we need to buy something new?
Understand. So I think one final question from my side for Chrysalites. What are the three most important priorities or the things that, as a Chrysalite, I should uh, plan for when it comes to sustainable fashion? What are the three most important things that we should maybe pledge to?
Yeah, it's interesting. We do this in our museum quite often. We ask you to take pledges across the board, and then we send you emails around it. There are obviously there are almost 15 to 20 things that you could do. Let me think of what I think are the top three. I definitely think overconsumption is a problem. And for us to question our consumption choices on a regular basis, do we need that extra or not? Or is there something within our wardrobes that we can refurbish? I think the second really key part is to the buying and selling. So actually don't think of your wardrobe as a waste. Your wardrobe is actually an asset, and there are opportunities for you to swap today, to sell today, if you need more varieties that most consumers do. So I think to be able to use your assets, so maintain your clothes and use your assets to actually swap or sell, I think that would be a really, really important aspect for Indian consumers, particularly to take, because that happens a lot. In Europe, it doesn't necessarily happen as much in India. What else? I do believe we all need to push the industry more to make the change happen. So we need the pressure on the brands. So also picking and choosing, if you have to buy new, which is the right brand, by learning more about their practices, by understanding what goes into the material, which legally has to be on the labels. I think that becomes that's how you decide where your dollars are spent. And that is your decision making to the brands. If you choose not to adopt a particular brand, they get the message when you don't spend the money there. So that's where we as consumers are powerful.
Good. One last question, since you mentioned about the brand and in the context of greenwashing. Okay, how much can you really trust what is there on the labeling?
That's a very interesting question. And I think it's something the industry is constantly changing and battling with. Because as I mentioned earlier, there are not a lot of this is a growing industry where the transparency is starting to come in the industry, but it's not established just yet. So sometimes the standardizations are not necessarily in place. But I would say the more it is changing quite quickly, and these getting the right things on their labels, etc., starting to get mandatory. Otherwise, these brands could get into trouble. So I would assume that we can now trust, or you don't have an option but to trust what's on the labels at the moment as a consumer. But sooner you'll see more transparency related metrics on the labels. And it's important as a consumer to dig deeper into that. For example, if something says sustainable collection, you can actually look that up. And at some point of time, we'll see new technologies like barcodes, etc., which you as a consumer should really scan before buying anything. But how much can you trust at the moment? I think as a consumer, you have no option but to trust what's on the label. But there are ways of substantiating it by going online. There are technologies or apps like Good on You, which actually give you a brand-wise rating of their sustainability practices and what are they actually doing. So if you're really an aware consumer, using apps like that to actually help you decide if as an overall ideology of the brand, their ratings, do you agree with them or not? Because again, when you spend your money on any product, you're basically giving a signal to that brand whether you think they're doing the right thing or not. So it is important to use these technologies to move forward.
So thank you, Priyanka. Thank you so very much. I was very delighted to have this conversation. I'm really grateful for the tips that you shared with us, and guidance on things like Good on You, which is, I'm sure we will actually go up and look at the websites and get more information whenever we are making a purchasing decisions. And as you mentioned, the advice goes that buy what you need and love what you have. So please use your clothes and don't allow them as far as possible to go to the landfills. With that, I just want to thank you once again, and I will hand over to Avik for the final session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Meenal. Thanks, Priyanka. I think this was very engaging and informative. The floor is now open for the Q&A session. To ask your question, please use the raise hand option on Zoom. After your name is announced, please unmute yourself and go ahead with your question. You can also share your questions by posting them in the Q&A tab on your Zoom interface. Please refrain from dropping your questions in the chat section and use the Q&A tab only. I think we already have, I mean, such is the attraction of this topic that we already have a bunch of questions lined up, and we'll get this going. So the first question comes from Shona Tatchell, who asks, once these new technologies are developed, tested, and piloted at scale, I guess she's speaking, Priyanka, to you about the new technologies you spoke about. How will incumbent manufacturers finance this process of transition to new types of infrastructure needed, whether it is machinery, supply chain, buildings, training, etc.? Because this may need to be financed at a huge scale. So what type of finance structures are being developed to support this?
This is a really interesting question and actually very much in line with the work I do. Particularly, it's not just about having the infrastructure financing. Financing becomes even more important because everything that we talk about in terms of technology, most of it is not proven. And when the technologies are not proven, it's actually much more high risk. And it is quite unfair to think that all of this risk could disproportionately be shared by suppliers, particularly. So there's no straight answer to this. At this moment, when you speak about blended capital, there's a lot of investment in the market, which is coming from, let's say, more catalytic funders who are pushing, or let's say nudging the industry to what do you call it? Nudging the industry to test and validate and move these technologies forward. We have organizations like Loudest Foundation, IDH, and so many more who are actually putting the really high-risk capital here. Then we look at other technology or other type of investments once it gets proven, let's say, or the risk is reduced, to then look at more debt-based organizations. We along with our partners also run a fund called Good Fashion Fund, which is to catalyze some of these investments, which is really debt-based. We're seeing a lot of movements within brands, where brands are working with different banks, organizations like International Finance Corporation, who are trying to create different tools across the board to basically finance this transition. When we say different tools, they're working capital tools, they're CapEx tools, etc. So more, I wouldn't say project financing, but yeah, blended in the manner of different tools that are coming in place. Now, there is precedence of this because a lot of this has been already done for renewable energy sector. And now we're starting to take similar learnings to put into these really disruptive technologies sector. So yeah, thanks, Shona. That was a very interesting question. Really a pain point in the industry at the moment.
Thanks, Priyanka. I'll move on to the next question from Srishti, who asked, is recycling and recycled clothing cheaper in terms of cost? And is it affordable with a guarantee of quality?
At this moment, recycling, if I go into the details, comes in two different formats. There is the basic recycling that has been going on for a very long time, which is very mechanical, where you shred something and you spin them into materials. Unfortunately, from a quality perspective, only a small part of it can be really high quality because the fiber lengths actually go shorter every time you recycle. So they are affordable or maybe almost at par to some extent to virgin materials. But whether the quality is at the highest, probably not. Whether recyclability is possible, not so much. On the other hand, we have some new age technologies that are starting to come, which are more on chemical recycling side. They unfortunately are very relatively nascent and are much more expensive in the market. And maybe at some point of time, just like any other technology, when they start out, it's expensive. When economies of scale hit, they become price competitive. And that's how we estimate will happen for this industry also. Meanwhile, the burden of this recycled material should really live with industry at large, not necessarily passed on to consumers. At least that is the thought process. But at the moment, you will see all sorts of things. You'll see more expensive, better communication story, recycled materials, but you'll also see in some cases brands communicating less and just keeping the cost the same.
Right. Thanks for that. The next question is from Shona again, and she asks, on the subject of extending the life of clothing through repair and rework, in many schools, sewing skills are no longer taught. What can the fashion industry do to make sewing a highly desirable skill to have for both boys and girls?
Yeah, this is a very Shona has very interesting questions, I realized.
She's quite concerned about this.
Yeah. I wish there was an answer I had for this one. I don't know what the fashion industry can do. Ideally, this is where education industry needs to step up to say some of the very basic life skills that we've now completely left, that were very relevant in the past, should be picked up. We're doing this here in our museum. We're trying to run workshops on embroidery, on rework, about repair, stitching, etc. We think that's what needs to be replicated other places also, but it's really an education industry and not so much a fashion industry task.
Got that. At this moment, just a reminder, if there are any questions, please do drop it into the Q&A tab window and we will pick them up with Meena, Priyanka and Maya. And till we get another question, Priyanka, I had a question of my own, and that's to do with the entire celebrity culture and the pop culture, right? I mean, how much of a role do you think that has in terms of really, I mean, we know that it has a huge role in influencing people's choices, but is there something that is being thought about by influencers in order to really promote and enable sustainable fashion in terms of either prolonging usage, buying less, or is it just bad for their business?
I believe more influencers have come up in this space, particularly sustainable fashion space. And I do believe celebrities or influencers really have to be held responsible to create some of these communication messages. And we've seen that trend change quite a lot. There are a lot more influencers now who are discussing and talking about sustainable fashion, also in India, also in outside, where this message of save the planet is quite embedded in their messaging. But what's also great is that not everybody needs to understand the technical sides of everything. It's really the basics. Here are the key takeaways for consumers that the influencers are doing, which is really important to get the conversation going and to keep it going and relevant.
The other question that I had, Priyanka, was that, in terms of, the Indian government has come out with this entire production linked incentive scheme, and one of the sectors is textiles as well. Is that an opportunity for India to really make a mark? I mean, it is a large textile market, but a large part of it is unorganized. And that is where perhaps some of these concerns emanate from as well. Is formalization of the market in a country like India a way to ensure best practices as far as sustainable fashion is concerned? Because labor or labor conditions is also an important part of sustainable fashion. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Absolutely. Sustainability would come both on the social side and environmental side. And historically, this industry has been very terrible on the social sustainability angle. Given that as an industry as a whole, with India, Bangladesh, the child labor issues, the working hour issues, and not great conditions of working conditions issues have been there. We believe there are a lot of organizations who are also working in this regard to improve the industry. Whether there is an opportunity for India to organize this, I mean, India is becoming more relevant, particularly when it comes to cotton production, given all the divestment that is happening in China. So it is really an opportunity for the Indian market. The question is, how quickly can we be organized? Can we really sell a sustainability story? Because this conversation has started, but the policies aren't in place for actually driving sustainability. Anything that you see that's coming in sustainable practice within India is really driven by brands who are buying from India, not so much the governmental actors. So I think the opportunities exist for governments to step up and say, here's our own strategy, maybe matching with the new policies, new Green Deal policies that are coming out, so that we know that it's aligned in the future and you're kind of future-proofing the textile industry of India, which at the moment is not the case. At the moment, it's completely reliant on what the international brands or industries are asking of the country.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a couple of more questions and maybe we'll take these and we are drawing to a close. I mean, we are short on time. The next question is from Elda Clarence, who asks that what should be the ideal choice of fabric when purchasing clothes? I mean, very fundamental but very important question, right?
Yeah, but one with not a very, let's say, easy to answer question. My suggestion would be always secondhand is better. But when you just talk about fabrics, I suppose staying away from the synthetics and moving more towards the natural materials. But when you look at the hierarchy of natural materials, materials like cotton, while amazing in performance quality, do use huge amount of water in the production. Every kg of cotton can go up to 25,000 liters of production. So it's better to look at alternate materials such as hemp, or if there are agri-waste available. Obviously, these materials are not necessarily as scale, but when you look at other bast fiber-based materials, they are less resource intensive while production. So
Right.
those would be the better criteria to look at. Hemp is actually really growing in India at the moment as a material, as a popular material to work with. But then India also works with banana and banana waste. So lots of opportunities available. It's more to dig deeper into what the impact is of the material.
Right. The next question is from Swapnil Deshpande, who asks which country is leading in terms of regulations for the fashion industry?
Instead of country, I would say in terms of as a continent, as a region, EU is, because the most policies are coming are driven pretty much by EU. And I believe US is following suit, but not maybe as fast. But EU has probably been ahead of the game for a long time, and newer policies or newer, let's say, standards that are going to come this year, which actually been quite rolling. Only yesterday, there were new standards around traceability and transparency. So I think within this year, we'll see a lot more movement in this regard. The question is, how quickly can other regions catch up or work together with this region to make some of those policies?
Yeah. Last question from my side, Priyanka. There is a leading international fast fashion chain which has started a program for exchanging clothes in exchange in lieu of a minor discount, right? If you exchange them at the store. Why aren't we seeing more brands follow suit? I mean, if it makes business sense for them, why does it not make for others?
It actually doesn't make business sense for anybody at the moment, because while this brand is also taking in all this material, they don't have a way to recycle it yet, or a way to sort it. A lot of what is happening today is that this waste is nicely being exported to Africa, the countries that are still accepting it. But it would make sense if they were selling it secondhand, but a lot of it still gets, about 70% of that waste goes to landfill still. And that's the scary part. Why brands aren't picking this up is because they need the solutions in place. Otherwise, what are they going to do with this stock?
Right.
And they all need to kind of work in parallel. The solution needs to come together with them collecting the waste also. And the solution has been slightly slower.
No, that's absolutely, I think that's eye-opening and good to know, and can inform people's decisions. You walk into a store and you may get enamored by the good to do kind of factor, but it's good to know the story behind the story. Priyanka, thank you so much. Maya, Meenal, thank you so much for your time today. We have, with this, we come to the end of this discussion. Thanks to everyone who joined in today and made it a very special conversation. Whether it is our mission of making markets function better, or the way in which we embrace and actually practice ESG, Crisil has always known to be at the forefront of positive change. Let us today collectively pledge to do our bit for making the fashion industry a bit more sustainable, one shirt or shoe at a time. Thank you so much. Goodbye.